We're going to be working with TypeScript, React, NextJS, and a Rails API built on the back end. I'm going to be using bcrypt as the encryption gem for the password on the Rails end, and for the styling and the UI, I'm using Tailwind and DaisyUI. So let me start by showing you the UI for our signup component. Okay, we have a simple form here. First name as an input, last name, username, email, password, password confirmation. We are also going to be working on building a component to validate password strength, which is going to be another one of our parameters as far as validation goes on the front end and back end to see if our password is good enough to pass that check. We'll create that and it'll be displayed under our password input. So let me introduce you to the code for the signup component. Very simple here. We've got a form element, and within that we've got input components rather than input tags, because inside this component I have a lot of styling that I'll just be reusing. We have our props, label, type, placeholder, required, hidden, value, name, and a handle change function. It's going to be pretty universal to update our state whenever the input element's value changes. So let's begin by defining the type for our signup parameters. I'm going to go to my types folder and create a new file called signup.ts. So we're going to define our type for our signup params, and we're going to name it signup params. And within that signup param object, we're going to have all of our inputs: first name, last name, username, email, password, and password confirmation, all typed to a string. Awesome. Now that we have our signup params typed, we're going to go ahead and define our state in our signup component. First, we want to import our useState hook. And we'll define our signup state as inputs. And since we have a type defined for our signup parameters, we're going to define that in our useState hook. So now we need to use all of our signup parameters and initialize those to an empty string. Now that we have our state defined for our signup parameters, it's important that we define a function that's going to update our state whenever a user changes the value within an input element. So we're going to call that function handle change. Since we're coding in TypeScript, we need to type our event. In this case, it's going to be a change event that's called on an HTML input component. So the way we'll type that is by writing react.changeEvent And we're calling that on an HTML input element. Now we need to define the name and value of our target element. We'll need to call our setInputs method to update our state. So how we'll do that is setInputs. We'll persist our previous state by using the spread operator. So what we'll have here is a function that takes in a parameter that we'll call prev. And we'll use the spread operator to keep the values in our object that we're not changing. And we only want to find the key that has the name that's associated to our input element that we're changing. We'll call that key by using brackets, name. And we'll set the value of that to our target element's value. Our next step is going to be to pass our state and our handle change function to each of our input components. So the value is going to equal inputs dot first name. And our handle change function will just equal handle change. I'll go ahead and copy this line because I'm going to be reusing it for each of our inputs. I'll actually copy both lines. That way I only need to change which key we're accessing in our object. So for this input, I just need to change the key to last name. For this input to username. Now that I have all of our props passed, I need to go ahead and make sure that it's working. So I'll add a console log right after our handle change function. We'll switch over to the UI and we'll just test that the state is updating appropriately. So let's open our console. And we'll type values in each of these inputs. As you can see here, our state is updating appropriately. Now I'm going to move on to updating our controller method and defining our routes for our user creation. So before I get to handling our call in the front end to the back end, I'm going to go ahead and start building out those methods and the routes in the back end so that we have something to work around in the front end. I'm going to move out of our client folder, switch over to our app and our user controller. Here we have controller methods that are default to our user model. Whenever we run Rails generate scaffold, we're going to come here and we'll see a lot of pretty default methods. There's only one that we're going to focus on changing, and that's going to be our create method. I want to start by checking our user params and just making sure that they are associated to the user params that we want to require from our user. So here we have first name, last name, username, email, and password digest, which is going to be handled by our bcrypt gem to accommodate our password and our password confirmation. So everything here looks good. Let's move back to our create method. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the default functionality they have. I'm going to define our params as our user params. I'm going to define our user as user.create and then pass in our params. Now, if our user is valid, we're going to go ahead and render that user in JSON and also return a status of created. So how we'll do that is we'll write a conditional if user.valid. We'll render JSON user and status created. Now in our conditional, we want to write an else statement. And in this else statement, we're just going to return our errors. So we're going to want to access user.errors.full-messages and also return a status of unprocessable. Great. To recap the functionality of this method, we're going to create a user using our user params. If the user is valid, we'll return that user's information along with an OK status message of created. If our user is not valid, i.e. we're missing some parameters or some of the parameters don't pass our validation, we're going to render the full messages of our user errors and a status message of unprocessable. Now, in order to access this method in our front end, we need to define a route that's going to link to our create method in our user controller. So we'll do that by going to our routes file, which is going to be found in our config folder. We'll define our route under the scope of v1. Essentially, this will define our route as v1 slash whatever route we're building. For example, localhost 4000 slash v1 slash signup. So I'll go ahead and create that route and we'll call it signup. And whenever our route v1 signup is accessed, we'll send that to our user method called create. Now we're going to move on to our user model where we're going to create a lot of validations. We're going to create these validations on the back end, and then we're going to use those validations to guide the validations we build on the front end. It's safe to build validations on the back end so you're not allowing things into the database that shouldn't be there. And it's an extra layer to build validations on the front end so that you're not sending anything to the back end that isn't valid data. So it's an extra layer. We're going to start by building the validations on the back end first. We'll need to go to our user model. Already we have defined has secure password, which is going to encrypt our password using bcrypt. All right, first we're going to start with some very simple validations. We want to make sure that all of our inputs exist. So we'll define that as onCreate, make sure that there's a presence. And that's how Rails will make sure that this parameter exists. And then we'll also set some limitations for the length. So we'll have length and define a minimum and a maximum, and that's going to be used for most of our values. So I'll start with our first name parameter. And we'll validate that whenever we call the create method, this parameter exists and it's at least 2 characters long and at most 50 characters long. I'm going to copy this logic and use the same logic for our last name parameter. And we'll use similar logic for our username parameter, but we'll adjust the minimum and maximum length. So we adjusted the length restrictions to between 3 and 15 characters. And also for our username and our email, we're going to want to make sure that it's a unique username. So we're going to set our uniqueness to true. I'm going to copy this line to use for our next parameter, which is going to be email. I'm going to remove the length restrictions or the length validation. And we just want to make sure that email exists when we call our create method and that it's the only email of its kind in our database. Now we're going to move on to validating our password. Has secure password is already going to check for the presence. So we'll just go ahead and define our validations for length for password. So we have our password restriction set to a minimum of 10 characters and a maximum of 30. And for password confirmation, we just want to validate that it exists. So we'll use presence on create for our password confirmation. Okay, now we're going to define some custom methods for our validations, and these are going to include a lot of regular expressions. I already have those regular expressions predetermined. I'm not going to talk too much about the syntax of them, but I will kind of talk about what they do. So we're going to start by defining a validation method for our first name. We're going to call that validate first name. And we only want to run this method if first name exists, so we can do return unless first name. Okay, so the pattern for adding errors to our parameter error messages, I'm going to duplicate throughout all of our custom methods. So I'll do a lot of copy and paste, but the first one I'll type out, and kind of just talk through it. So the first thing that we're going to do is type errors add. Essentially, this is going to look for the parameter that you're looking to add the error message to, and you can also pass in a string that you want the error message to be. In this case, our parameter is going to be first name, and the first error message we're going to build for our validation is going to be can only be letters. So it's going to be first name can only be letters. And we only want to add that error message unless our first name parameter matches a regular expression that's going to look for only letters. And this is our regular expression that's going to look for only letters that are either lowercase or capital A through Z. All right, I'm going to copy this pattern here and add another line. And this error message is going to be must not have any blank spaces. And we're going to use this same line for every single method that we're going to build from here on out, because all of our inputs, we don't want to have any blank spaces in them. So I'm going to change this message here to must not have any blank spaces. And instead of unless, we're going to change this to if first name matches, and we're going to look globally for any spaces. This regular expression is just going to look in the string to see if there's any spaces. And if there are, it's going to return true. So we only want to add this error if first name includes an empty space. We're going to go ahead and add this to our validations. So we're going to call validate and pass in our validate first name custom method. And as we continue to build our methods, we'll just add them to the end. And I'm going to go ahead and type validate last name because we're going to copy the same logic for our first name method and use it for last name. Great. And now we can go ahead and move on to username. Okay, so for one of the errors for our username, we want to make sure that it only has letters, numbers, or underscores. So we're going to change this message to can only have letters, numbers, or underscores. So we're going to change our regular expression to include A through Z, capital and lowercase, but also 0 through 9 and any underscores. We'll keep this error method as it is because we also want to make sure that there's not any blank spaces. Now we can move on to validating our email. Okay, so our first validation for our email, we're just going to want to make sure it's a valid email. There's a very complicated regular expression that I found for this. I had this predetermined already, so I'm just going to copy and paste this one. And And we're going to change our error message to include the email that we used. So we'll put email and plus our error message. And our error message is going to be is not a valid email address. So we're going to add this error message to our errors for our parameter email and include the email in the error message. So whatever you type in, abc@nothing.com, and this regular expression doesn't return true, it's not going to verify it as a valid email address, and it'll say abc@nothing.com is not a valid email address. Also, we want to make sure we don't have any blank spaces. We can go ahead and add our validate username and our validate email methods to our validations at the top. Now we can move on to validating our password. We'll define this method as validate password. Use the same logic of return unless password. And we'll also want to reuse our must not have any blank spaces error message. Now we want to create an error method that's going to check for three things. We're gonna have three different error messages that we're going to start with. One to check for at least one capital letter, another to check for at least one lowercase letter, and one to check for our password to contain at least one number. So this regular expression is going to check to see if our password contains at least one character that's a capital letter A through Z. We're going to go ahead and copy this and use similar logic for lowercase letter. We'll change our error message to say password must contain at least one lowercase letter, unless the password has at least one lowercase letter. Copy the logic again. And here we're going to change our error message to say must contain at least one number. Unless our password has at least one number. And the regular expression for that is going to be checking for D, which is going to code the digits, and a plus sign, which checks for any digit to exist. So we'll do this. There. It's just going to search the string for at least one digit. All right, another validation we're going to want to create for our password is that it can only have a select list of special characters that we'll allow. That's going to be a $, @, exclamation point, underscore, or dash. And if the password includes anything outside of that, then we'll return a message that says can only have those special characters. Okay, so here we're going to add this error message can only have $, !, underscore, or hyphen as special characters unless our password matches this regular expression that's going to look for a digit, capital letters, lowercase letters, and then those special characters that we listed. Okay, so for our password validation, as far as the password strength goes, we're going to use the gem zxcvbn. I'll leave a link to the documentation for that in the description as well. Essentially, it's going to check the password strength for us. Originally created by Dropbox. There's a package for it that you could use on the front end as well. I found that using the packages on the front end and on the back end, I can kind of get different results. So we're going to build the validation on the back end, and then later on we're going to build a custom method that our front end can call to use the same results that we would get from our gem in Rails to make sure that what we're displaying in the front end is just going to be on par with what our backend validation is going to be as well. We don't want to have a situation where in the UI we're displaying that the password is very strong, user goes to submit, and then we have a backend failure because they're using different parameters as far as the npm package and the Rails gem. So I already have that gem installed. Again, I'll leave the documentation in the description if you want to go through it. It's very simple. You just have to add zxcvbn gem to your gem file and run bundle install. And I'm going to go ahead and define our password score now using that method. Okay, now that we have our password score defined, we're going to check to see if that password score is greater than 3. zxcvbn is going to return an object that has a key of score. That's going to be a value between 0 and 4 or 5, I believe. And we want to make sure that our password strength is at least greater than a 3. If not, then we'll return an error that says password not strong enough. And now we need to add our validate password method to our validations. And there's one last parameter, and that's going to be password confirmation. However, our bcrypt gem is already going to handle the validation for checking to make sure that our password confirmation matches our password, so we don't need to build a custom validation for that. Now we're going to switch over to defining our front-end call to create user. We're going to go back to our signup component. So here we're going to build a function that's going to be called handle submit. Whenever a user clicks this button, we want to go ahead and submit that form. We also need to type our parameters for this function as well, and it's going to be an event, but this time it's going to be a mouse event, and we're going to look for that mouse event to be called on an HTML button element, because down here at the end of our form, our submit button is a button element. So our parameter is going to be event react.mouseEvent on an HTML button element. On a button element, whenever it's clicked, there's a default action to refresh the page, and we don't want that action. So what we're going to type is event.prevent default. Now, before we make our call to the backend, I want to note that I'm using Axios to make our calls to the backend. So I'm going to go ahead and input Axios so that we can use that in our call method here. You can use fetch if you'd like. I like using Axios because it has some functionality that makes testing feel a little bit easier. So I'm going to go ahead and import Axios. And start defining our call to the backend. So it's going to be axios.post. And our first parameter is going to be the URL that we're going to call for our backend. I'm using NextJS, and I have an environment variable that's set for our development environment that's going to be coded to our localhost 4000, which is what I have my backend set to. So whereas yours might look like localhost 3000 or 4000, or maybe just the v1/signup URL, mine's going to have process.env and then our next _public_API_URL. So this part might look a little different for you. But if you want to learn more about this, I'll also include setting up your environment variables for your API URLs for NextJS in the description. Okay, next we want to add the parameters that we're going to be sending with our post method. It's going to be all of the input values. So first name, last name, username, email, password, and password confirmation. I'm just going to include that object right here. And just to kind of note here, I'm using camel case for our variables that are set in the front end, and on the back end, I'm using underscores. So yeah, we're going to pass this object through, and then we want to handle our response. For now, we're just going to console log our response and console log our errors as well. I made the mistake of closing off the parameter after our URL. We also need to include the body in that, and we'll close off the parameters after we include the body. Okay, so now we'll handle our response and our errors and console log those. Okay, so now we want to pass our handle submit as our onClick event to our button element. So I'm going to go down to our button element, and we're going to define the event handler onClick, and we're going to set that to handle submit. And now we're at a point where we can test this call in our front end. So I'm going to go back to the UI, open up our console, and we already have the response and the errors console logged. So we'll be able to see what's going on as we try to make this call. So we already have some inputs here. Let's go ahead and submit. I've got an error here, and as I look at my server, it looks like there might be a syntax error in our user controller, so I'm going to go ahead and check that out. Okay, so it looks like I forgot to add the colon here. Let's go back to the UI and try again. There we go. The message that we're looking for, the status message at least, is a 422. So let's go ahead and open up our response. Let's zoom in a little bit here. Go to our data and our errors, and we're seeing that we're displaying a lot of the errors that we're expecting. Let's see, password can't be blank. It is concerning though because our password is not blank. Password is too short is something that we'd expect, and it says password confirmation can't be blank. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to my user model. Okay, so I actually came over to our user controller, and I suspect that the error might be here. Looks like we're passing password digest. I know bcrypt is supposed to handle the password and password confirmation, but we're going to just go ahead and try to set this to password and password confirmation. I believe it's looking for these parameters and we don't have them. So let's go ahead and start there and see if that changes any of the error messages we're getting. Okay, it looks like we were successful in changing that. We're not showing that anything's empty, and we don't have anything empty here. We're showing some errors that we would expect to see. The password is too short. Password needs to contain these parameters, and it's also not strong enough. Looks like our email is in the format of an email, so let's change that just to make sure that we're going to get error for that email. Awesome. So it looks like we may need to add a space here just for this error messaging. I'm just going to go to the user model and just add a space. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to leave all these blank and just make sure that we're getting error messages for all of our inputs. Password can't be blank, it's too short. Can't be blank, too short. Okay, yeah, so it looks like we're getting all of the validations that we would expect to get. Okay, so I noticed that some of these validations are running even though we're leaving things blank. So I'm going to try by switching all of these return unless to return if, and then we're going to check to see if this is an empty string. Awesome. So it looks like the only validations we're running now to check on the presence and also the length. And those are what we're expecting to see here. Okay, so now we're going to move on to defining the validation on the front end. We're going to pretty much use the backend validations to kind of guide how we're doing that. And we're not even going to send the call to the backend unless these validations pass in the front end. So we're going to start by defining the type for our signup errors. Let's go ahead and open up our types folder and our signup types. Right below this, we're going to define our signup errors, and we're going to use all of our input values. We're going to use all of the same input keys, and we're just going to change those to be equal to arrays of strings. Okay, let's go back to our signup component. And right below the state for our inputs, we're just going to define the state for our errors. And we're just going to initialize those with empty arrays. So I'm going to copy this logic. Now, in order to create the validation for the front end, we're going to use a lot of the same logic that we used on the back end, but we're going to create a file in our utility folder, and we're going to call that validation.ts. And we're going to handle all of our error validations there, and we'll create a function that then we'll export and call in our signup component. So let's navigate to our util folder, create a file, and we're going to call it validation.ts. So here we're going to create a function, and we're going to call it validate signup params. And we're also going to export that because we're going to be importing it in our signup component. All right, the parameter that we're going to be taking here is going to be our signup params. So we're going to type that to our signup params. Let's define an object that's going to hold our errors, and the type of that error is going to be our signup errors. I just copied the state that we initialized in our signup component and used that for our errors that we're holding in this helper function. So now we're going to build a switch case, and we're going to go through each of these parameters that we're taking in. We're going to validate each one, and any errors that we get, we're going to push that error string into our array. And at the end, we're going to be returning signup errors. And in the end, we're going to be returning our signup errors, so we can add that as our return type. I'm going to build a switch statement, and we're going to go through each of the keys of our parameter object and check for those validations. So we're going to start by doing object.keys, taking our params, and then for each key, we're going to look to see if those, so for each key, we're going to build helper functions that are going to validate our errors for us. So we're going to go ahead and start by defining our case statement, and then we'll go ahead and build those helper methods. So now we're going to set our first name errors to a helper method that we're going to define in a moment. So let's go ahead and define first name errors, and we'll set that to a helper method that we'll define as validate name. That helper method is going to take our parameter for first name. So let's go ahead and define that. And what this helper function is going to do is return an array of errors for first name which could be an empty array. And then once we have that value, we're going to set that array in our errors to be the result, or whatever's returned from this helper function. All right, so I'm going to copy this logic and just change the name of things as I go along so that we have our switch statement pretty much defined. Now let's start defining our helper functions. So here I want to start by defining our validate name. The parameters that we're going to take in is going to be our value, which is a string. So for validate name, we can reuse this functionality. So I'm also going to pass in a parameter that's just going to be type. And our type could either be first name or last name. And we'll just append that to the beginning of our error message. So here we'll do first name. And last name. So we'll have type and we'll type it to string. Okay, so let's define our errors as an empty array. Okay, so the first validation that we want to have is just to make sure that it's not blank. So we're going to reuse this logic as well for each of our custom helper functions. But here we're just going to check to see if the value.length is 0. And if it is, then in our errors, we'll push our error message of first name or last name can't be blank. And then we'll just go ahead and return errors from there because we don't need to run any more validations if we know that our input is already blank. Okay, so we'll use a template literal to pass in our type into our string, and we'll just push this message that first name or last name can't be blank, and we'll return those errors. So now we can move on to some more validations, and these are going to be using the same regular expressions that we used on the back end. Okay, so let's use this similar logic that we did on the back end. We'll write conditionals to see the regular expressions if they match or don't match, and we'll push the errors depending on that. So our first one for names, we just want to make sure that it's only letters. So we'll go ahead and use the similar logic. We'll write a conditional here, if, and we'll use that regular expression. All right, so we're just checking to make sure that our string matches lowercase or uppercase A through Z. And if it does not, then we'll go ahead and push those errors that say, hey, first name or last name can only be letters. I'm just going to copy this logic to the next line, where we're going to test for the length of our value. So here, if value.length is less than 2, because we want our first name to be between 3 and 50, then we'll push the error message of first name or last name is too short. And then we'll also use the same error message that we did on the back end that shows you what the minimum is. Minimum is 2 characters. So let's go ahead and define that. Copy this logic to the next line, where we're going to write a conditional for the other end of the spectrum, where our value is greater than 50. And now, if you can remember from our backend validation, for most of these, we want to make sure that we're checking that there's no blank spaces. So we're going to write some logic here that we're going to reuse for our helper functions for the rest of our parameters as well. And we're just going to test for any blank spaces. Okay, I noticed that I made a mistake here. I need to move this helper function outside of the scope of our validate signup params function. And after all this validation, we're going to return our errors. So this function is going to be used for our first name and last name. Now we need to build some validation for username. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. We want to keep the same logic that checks to see if our value is empty, but we just want to change the name here to username. And we can remove this extra parameter. All right, so for username, it's not only going to be letters, we also allow numbers and underscores. So we're going to use that regular expression to test username. And the error message is going to be username can only be letters, numbers, or underscores. And we have similar logic for checking the length, except our minimum and maximum are going to be different. So we're going to change this to 3. And the maximum to 15. And again, our username can't have any blank spaces, and we'll go ahead and return those errors. Okay, we'll move on to email now, so validate email. Similar logic, we want to make sure that it's not blank. And the regular expression that we're going to use for email, we're going to copy from our backend. And then kind of return the same message that we built on the back end. So we're going to have email, and then we're going to have a template literal that includes the email. And then is not a valid email address. Okay, so we did not build any length limitations on our email address. So we're going to go ahead and just remove these. And again, we want to make sure that we're checking for any blank spaces, so we can leave this as it is. And now we can move on to validating the password. I'm going to copy our username helper method. And we're going to change this one to password. All right, keeping the logic of it being blank. For our password, first we want to test the length. And we want to make sure that it's at least 10 characters long. So we'll change that minimum to 10. And update our maximum to 30. Okay, so if you could remember the validations for our backend, we had requirements of the password containing at least one capital letter, one lowercase letter, and one number. Our error message is going to be password must contain at least one capital letter. We're going to copy this to the next line. And repeat this logic for lowercase letters. Then go to the next line and copy this logic for digits. So it must contain at least one number. We'll check for any digits. We only need it to match once, which is what the plus sign will denote. We test for blank spaces, and also we test for special characters. And there's a list of special characters that we allowed. If you can remember, it's $, @ exclamation, underscore, and hyphen. So we're just going to copy that logic into here. So here we're checking for these special characters along with the digits and letters. And if it doesn't match, we'll go ahead and send password can only have these as special characters. Okay, now we have one more validation helper method to build, and that's going to be to validate our password confirmation. Our parameters are going to be our value as a string, but also we want to take in as a parameter our password because we want to check it against our password confirmation to make sure that it matches. So we'll call that compare, and that'll be a string. We want to add that parameter when we call validate password confirmation. So here we're going to pass in params.password. So I'm going to copy the logic that we have for validate password, check to see if password confirmation is blank. And then the only validation that we need to build here is checking to see if our value matches compare. So if our password confirmation matches our password. So if value doesn't equal compare, we'll add an error message that states that. Awesome, so now we have our validations built on the front end. We're going to go ahead and import this function, validate signup params, and use that on the front end. Also want to note that we're going to be adding some validation for our password once we get to the point of building our password strength component. For now, we're going to go ahead and start by just passing these validations into the front end call and make sure we're not making any requests to the back end if our validations don't pass. So let's import our validate signup params function. So I'm going to go ahead and call our setErrors method, and we're going to set our errors to whatever's returned from our validate signup params function when we pass in our inputs. I'm going to return to our validation file because we also need to build a function that's going to let us know if any errors exist. And we don't want to hold that necessarily in our signup component, so we're going to hold that back in the validation file that we built. And right below our signup, right below our validate signup params function, we're going to define is valid signup params. We're going to pass in our errors, which is going to be typed to our signup errors. We're going to define valid using let. And then we'll go through all of our errors. So we'll use object.keys to get all of our error keys. And we'll just see if the array is empty. And if the array is empty, then we'll skip through. If the array is not empty, then we're going to go ahead and set valid to false. And at the end of this, we'll return valid. So let's do object.keys, errors, and then for each. key. And we want to check to see if the errors for that key is empty or not. We're using TypeScript, so it's looking for this to be a key of signup errors. So we can go ahead and explicitly name this as key of signup errors. And that should get rid of that error message. All right, so if we find any errors, we're going to just set valid to false and return valid. So now we can just import this function here into our signup component. Now we're only going to make that post call if we have a valid reason to, so if all of our validations pass. So let's go ahead and do is valid signup params, and we'll pass in our errors. Now we'll wrap this in a conditional, and we'll say if. So if this returns true, if it is valid, then we'll make our call. Okay, so we still have an error here, and that's because we didn't put export in front of our is valid signup params function. Great. Now I have a reusable component called errors. Let me dive into that real quick. And in this component, we're just going to be mapping the errors. So I have some styling sent here, and it takes in an array of strings as our errors. So underneath each of our inputs, we're going to render our errors if there's any values in our error array. So first, I want to make sure that I'm importing that error component. And then conditionally rendering the errors component. So for first name, it's going to look like errors.firstname.length, and we'll check to see if that's true. And if it's true, then we'll render our errors component with our errors passed in as a prop. Otherwise, we'll return null, and no errors component will be rendered. Okay, now before I start copying this logic for the rest of our inputs, I kind of just want to make sure that this is working in the UI. So let's switch over to our UI, leave first name blank. There we go. An error message is popping up. Looks like our validations are working. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy this logic and use it underneath each of our input components. And as I'm going, I'm being sure to change the key that we're accessing. All right, now that I've got all of those conditionally rendered, I just want to make sure that I've got everything correct here, and I'm going to start testing it in the UI just to make sure that we're getting our error messages populated in the right spots and the validations are working. Awesome, looks like things are working. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on our password strength component and the logic for our password strength component, which is going to live right underneath our password input. So under our reusable components, I'm going to create a new component and I'll call it password strength. Okay, so I've got our password strength component here. Now I'm going to just build the interface for the props, which we're just going to take in a number. And that number is going to be the score that we receive from our backend call that we're making to the zxcvbn gem to give us our password score. So let's start here by just defining the interface. Okay, so I have our interface defined, and then I have our props passed through, and type those to our password strength props. Next, I'm going to set an array of strings that's just going to display to our user to determine if the password's weak, okay, good, strong, or very strong. Now I'm going to do some styling for our password component. I'm using Tailwind and DaisyUI. I know a lot of this, and I'm going to just kind of be talking through it as I'm doing it. But kind of to give you the logic, we're going to have a parent div that we're going to map an array. And within that array, we're going to have class names that are going to be rendered depending on the level of our password strength. So we'll get a meter that's going to be grayed out initially, and then as that password strength increases, the color of each of those 5 cells is going to increase to coordinate with our weak, okay, good, strong, and very strong password text. So I'll go ahead and start by doing return. We'll have a parent div. And within that div, we'll create another div that's just going to hold the parent element for our password meter. The way Tailwind works is that there's predetermined class names, and you can kind of just call those class names to build out whatever component you're trying to build. So for this one, I'm going to need it to be flex, and I'm going to need it to be flex row because we're going to have 5 children that are displayed across the screen horizontally that are going to give us our password strength. So I'll call it flex row. And we want the width to be 100% of its parent component. So we're just type w-full. That's the class name for 100% width. We're going to set the margin of the top to 3 and margin bottom 1, just to give it some space. So MT for margin top and MB for margin bottom. The way that we're going to handle the logic is we're going to have an array of class names. And depending on the password score, we're going to change the background color of each of those 5 children elements. So we're also going to need to create another prop that we're passing in here. We're going to call it password strength array. And that's going to be an array of strings. All right, that array is always going to have a length of 5, which is exactly what we need. I'll get to that logic once we switch over to our signup component. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and map those 5. Okay, so level string is going to be the background color for the element, and index we're just going to pass as the key. Whenever you're mapping children, you want to make sure that you're including a key. We're going to set the class name to a width that's a fifth of the parent component because we're going to have 5 equal children components, and we want to make sure that they all have the same width. So now down here is where we're going to create a div that's going to have our class name. It's going to be rendered based on the level that we're passing through from our password strength array. We want to set the height to 2 so that it's actually displaying on the UI before we set the background. All right, and this level is going to be a string that sets the background. Depending on each value within this password strength array, so we're going to use that to determine the background color of this div element. Now, another thing that we're going to want to display to the users is just the password text that shows the password strength. Okay, so we're going to define some class names here. We want our text to be small, our text also to be gray, and since I'm using our dark theme here, I'm gonna want to make sure that I'm setting it in the dark theme to white. So dark text white. And within this span element, we're gonna have strength. our strength is going to be password text, and then the index of the password strength. So if you could remember from the back end, I said that our password score was going to be between 0 and 4. Well, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in our password text array. So whatever the score is, we're going to display that. So if it's 0, weak, 1, okay, 2, good, 3, strong. And we're looking for something that's at least strong. All right, and also we're going to have some logic that is going to tell us if our input is empty. If there's no password entered in the input, then it's not just going to be a weak password, it's going to be empty. And we'll set that to -1 rather than the index of the password text is 0. So whenever there's no password, there's not going to be a score of 0, there's going to be a score of -1. So in that case, we want to display empty. There's no more work now that we need to do in the password strength component. We can move back and start creating the logic for our backend call for our password strength component. So in our signup component, we're going to initialize some state that we're going to handle in our password strength component. And those are going to be the password strength and the password strength array. So right below the state that we already have defined, I'm going to define password strength, and we're going to set it to -1. We're going to type this to a number and initialize to -1. And now we're going to initialize state for our password strength array. And that's going to be an array of strings. And here we're going to initialize it to an array of length 5, and we're going to fill it with the background color that we want to be our default, which is just a gray. So array of length 5. And we'll fill that array with a string that's going to give our background a gray color. So now I'm going to want to go ahead and import our password strength component. And we'll want to render that right underneath our password input. And we'll pass in the props, password strength, and password strength array. All right, now if we go over to the UI, we should see a gray line underneath our password input. Awesome, and we have the text of strength that's set to empty. So now, since we have password strength defined now, we can go ahead and update our validations as well. So we're going to add a parameter to validate signup params. That's going to be password strength. So validate signup params, inputs, and then also password strength. And password strength is going to be a number. And now we want to find our validate password helper function and just add password strength. Now we can go down to this function. We'll include that parameter here as well. And type it to a number. And down here we can just write a conditional that lets us know if our password strength is less than 3. We'll add an error that says password strength not strong enough. So if password strength less than 3. Oh, made a typo here. Strength. Password strength less than 3. Errors.push. Password not strong enough. Okay, now we're going to define a method in our user controller. So we're switching back over to the backend and go to our user controller. And right here, we'll just define a new method that we'll call password score. All right, so here we'll define password as our parameters that require password. And we'll define score as the result of calling that zxcvbn method on our password and getting the key of score. So we'll go ahead and define that score. Test that password and access score. And now all that we're going to do is render JSON that includes that score. So render JSON score, and we'll set it to score. Great. Now before we move back to the front end, we have to define the route for this. So we're going to go back to our config folder and go to our routes. And we'll just define another post call. The endpoint for this will be password score. And that route will call our method password score in our users controller. So users password score. Perfect. Now we can write some logic that's just going to go ahead and call that backend method, and we're going to set password strength to whatever it returns. If we have a password input, we're not even going to call it if our password input is empty. We'll just set password strength back to -1. So I actually need to import a useEffect hook. And the reason we're using useEffect is because we want this to be called whenever password changes. So we'll add password to our dependency array for useEffect, and whenever the password changes, we'll make this call. And remember, we're only going to make this call if we have a password in our input. So if inputs.password All right, our endpoint, remember, was v1/password score. Again, this is just a development environment variable that's just going to be our localhost 4000 for our backend. And now we need to pass in the body, which is just going to be password. All right, and then whatever our response is, we're going to want to set our password strength to whatever data that we're getting that includes that score. So let's do then response and we'll check to see if the response status is 200. And if so, we'll set password strength to our response. In this case, it's response.data, and then if you can remember on the back end, we gave it the key of score. So response.data.score. We'll write an else statement that just says, if our password is empty, we'll go ahead and reset our password strength back to -1. All right, and we want to make sure that this hook only runs whenever our password updates. So we'll create a dependency array here, and we'll do inputs.password. Now we need to define some logic that's going to handle the password strength array state. So first I want to build a helper function that's going to pretty much create the new colors for our background for whatever array we have. So let me start by building that helper function. We're going to call that create new colors. I'm going to take in a parameter of colors, which is going to be a string, and strength, which is going to be a number. And for this, we're going to return an array of strings of length 5. We'll set a const new colors to our default array. All right, so we have new colors set to our default array, which is just an array with our gray background. And now we're going to map that array, and we're going to change this background color depending on if the index is less than the password strength. So let's go ahead and define that logic. Here we'll set level class to let. We're going to update this later. And we'll set that to level. So right now, BG grade 200 is what level class is set to. And conditionally, we'll update that depending on if the index is less than or equal to strength. So if the index is less than or equal to our password strength, we're going to set level class to whatever color we're passing in. And I'm going to name this color instead of colors because there's only going to be one color we're passing in. And at the end of this, we'll return level class. And we'll have an array that has these background colors mapped to whatever they're supposed to be. And at the end of this, we'll have an array called new colors that has strings of background colors that are determined by whether or not the index is less than or equal to the strength of our password. So we'll go ahead and return new colors. And now we're going to use this helper function within our useEffect that's going to update our password strength array. So right underneath our useEffect that we use to set the password strength, we're going to use another useEffect hook. And this time our dependency array is only going to include password strength. So whenever password strength is updated, which essentially is whenever our first useEffect hook is called and our password is changed, then we're going to handle some logic to update our new colors for the array that we're using in password strength. So we're going to set that conditionally. Now, if the password strength equals 4 or equals 3, we're going to use a color that tells the UI that the password is strong, which is going to be green. If the password strength is 2, we'll use yellow, and if it's less than that, we'll use red just to show that it's weak. So let's go ahead and start by using our conditional for if the password strength equals 4 or if it equals 3. So in this case, we're going to set strong to the result of our create new colors whenever we pass in the password strength of 4 or 3 and also the background color of green. And then we're going to set our password strength array to strong. Now I'm going to move over to the UI and see if this part of the logic is working. So whenever we type in something super complicated, we should start seeing some green background colors. Looks like it's working, so we can go ahead and complete the logic for the yellow and for the red background colors. So here we'll write else if, and we'll do else if just for password strength equals 2. That's going to be the one that we're going to use the yellow background color for. And here we're going to set our password strength array to good. I think I'm going to change the names of these because it might make more sense to just call this color array. Awesome. And now we'll write an else statement that's just going to check to see if the password strength isn't 432, then it's got to be 1 or 0, so it's going to be weak. And our new color for this is going to be red. Now, so we can go ahead and test to make sure that our password strength meter is working in the UI. So when it's a weak or okay password, we should see red for the first 2 children elements. And if the password is good, we should see yellow for the first 3 child elements. And if it's strong, we should see the background color be green for the first 4, or 5 if it's very strong. And we should also see the text update as well, displaying whether it's weak, okay, good, strong, or very strong. So let's switch over to our UI and start typing some passwords. Great. And again, the reason that we use the call to the backend is just to make sure that the results that we're getting for the score are going to be the same versus using the npm package for zxcvbn and the gem. So now I just want to go ahead and try to create a valid user and make sure that we're actually getting that user created in our database. All right, so it looks like we got a status of 201 and created. We can also double check by calling our index route. So we just want to make sure we're accessing our resources and our routes. So I'll go back to the code, go to our config folder and our routes. And here we can do resources, users, and that'll give us access to index, show, etc. So we can go ahead and go back to the browser. And we can see that the user was created. And it looks like we have our password encrypted as well, so that worked. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know if you like this video. It's my first video, so maybe give me some pointers on what I could do better next time, or if there's anything specific that you guys want to go through, whether it's data structures or algorithms. And also, if you have any questions about any of the code that I went through, I'll try to leave a lot of notes in the description and links to some documentation in the description. And now I'll say the thing. Make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you like and subscribe. Okay, I'm done recording this video now.